Okay, well, look, we might just move on to Rod now to talk about preparedness.
Thank you all. So the preparedness, the first slide's very short and sweet. It's about just what activities we're doing for the next 6 months, or what's less than 6 months now. The Fruit Fly Code of Practice has taken up quite a bit of our time, a lot more than we had planned, but I'll talk a bit more about that in the next section, and Darryl will also talk a bit about it in the fruit fly area. But I think one of the areas for members to think about for the next financial year is looking at developing systems for emergency permits. One of the things with the biosecurity planning processes that's coming up quite regularly is industries need to start sort of talking about, thinking about getting prepared if exotic pests do come into Australia, what chemicals, etc., have they got available to manage them. And the grains industry has been quite progressive in that space. There's a couple of projects that have been completed so far for this part of the year. So the next one is the initiatives for next year. There will be some continued work on the Fruit Fly Code of Practice. We're working with the Australian Government, and in working with that space, we're also working with the National Fruit Fly Council and with the Plant Health Committee to get that work undertaken and completed. And there is quite a, for those of you who are in the horticulture space will know that fruit flies is quite topical at the moment, so there is quite a lot of emphasis to get that work completed. The next one, which is the interstate trade reform position, is quite an exciting opportunity, I think, for PHA members, particularly, again, for horticulture members, more so than the sort of sugar or cotton type industries. But what it is PHC has recognised that it is now timely to review the interstate trade system, and that includes the ICAs. It includes the information that John McDonnell presented to the National Biosecurity Roundtables, and he also presented it to Plant Health Committee. They're sort of saying these sort of systems need to be looked at and reformed. Plant Health Committee has agreed to cost share a position which they've asked PHA to house, and this position will work with the PHC committee to look at how we can improve the interstate trade system, tap into other systems that are out there for industries, how we can recognise and extend third-party arrangements as being pioneered by the Biosecure HACCP arrangements. And it will also look at how we can simplify for industry some of the domestic trade arrangements, including things like what lettering has to go on consignments, what size of lettering is that goes on consignments, which is currently all inconsistent across the country. So the other big area of activity for this part of the company is the biosecurity plans and manuals, and I'll talk about that next. So the new biosecurity planning process has been in place for some time now, and I won't read through all the information on the slides, but the key to it is having now planning to put biosecurity plans for a 5-year process. We're actually getting a discussion with both government and industry about what things need to be done to implement the plans. Prior to this new process being in place, the plan was completed and quite often it sat on the shelf. But what we're now finding is there's quite an intense and detailed discussions about how the plans can be implemented. And there's some prioritisation going on. This is what we should do year 1. This is what we need to do in year 2. And there's also some quite mature and robust discussions going on about where the funding and who should be responsible for the various activities goes on. There's also one of the interesting questions, and it feeds into the work of the DEEP team is as well, is that industries are now starting to question if we do have these high priority pests on our biosecurity plan and recognising they are high priority pests, what plans should we be putting into place should those pests arrive? Should we be thinking about going to business as usual straight away because the pests are unlikely to be eradicated unless certain circumstances are met? And they're saying, well, if that is the case, what systems, what measures do we need in place to make sure that we can deal with the pest and with the minimum impact on industry? I think that maturity of the conversation is quite a feature of the new process. So in summarising, you can see on this slide all of the reviews that are underway. And again, I won't go through them all. You can pick up your industries if they're there. But the one that is particularly of interest is the acacia one. The work on the acacia biosecurity plan has been funded by the National Biosecurity Committee and the Australian Government. And it's the first time we've looked at an environmental production biosecurity plan together. And we're actually holding a meeting mid next month, and we're actually bringing environmental people and states and territory people together with the industry as well. And the industry stakeholder group is much more extensive in this space than it is for our normal biosecurity planning processes. So, for example, we've got some of the Indigenous populations coming to the meeting to look at bush foods. We've got some of the mining companies coming with rehabilitation type work. So it's a much broader suite of members than we normally would have. So it's quite an interesting and exciting project. It'll be interesting to see where it goes to once it's completed. The next list here is, again, mainly for information for people. It's the list of biosecurity plans that are currently due for review in the system. They are reviewed about every 5 years. All the plans on that table, if your industry is up there, there is a preliminary proposal developed and has been submitted to the appropriate RDC for consideration. And we've also consulted with each of the peak industry bodies about the process as well. So they're all basically in train at this stage, and hopefully they don't all come through at the same time, as we won't have the resources to manage them, but we're looking at trying to stagger them coming through so we can manage them all efficiently and effectively. So the next topic is the biosecurity manuals. Now, the biosecurity manuals support the biosecurity plans in that the biosecurity manuals are the information that goes to growers. The biosecurity plans themselves are high-level documents that are used by government and the peak industry bodies and PHA to drive up the discussions in the implementation planning. And the biosecurity manuals are the hands-on documents that we give out to growers. And in fact, there was quite a discussion with the onion industry, which is the last one we've just produced, into making sure that the picture on the front cover was something that growers related to and not, as the industry advised us, a bureaucratic document that sits in Canberra. So those industries you can see up there, there's some industries up the top that have got manuals already in place. And if you look at some of the dates, there's ones that really should be updated, given the biosecurity plans have been updated. Sugarcane's the one exception in the first list, which was updated last year. There is a number of industries in that second part of the table, industries with biosecurity plans under or due for review, where we're currently reviewing the biosecurity plans and would recommend you don't update the manuals so after the biosecurity plan is complete, in case the high priority pests, etc. change. And the other one is ones that we have been involved with in doing some work, and there are other resource documents available as well, and we're using slightly different approach for the biosecurity planning process. So this is a list now, again, for members to start to think about, is a list of industries that don't have manuals in place. And as you can see, there's quite a few industries that don't have biosecurity manuals in place. And again, urge you to think about this in the context of providing biosecurity information relevant to your growers. So it's about fact sheets about exotic pests and diseases. It includes information on how you ensure that exotic pests and even established pests and diseases don't come onto your property, what biosecurity practices you can put in place. And it would be very valuable, and PHA would be more than happy to talk to any one of the industries there that would like to consider developing a biosecurity manual for their growers. We're more than happy to talk to you about putting some funding submissions in with you into the relevant RDCs. The bottom list, which talks about industries with other resources available, we're looking at developing biosecurity planning for those in a slightly different way. So, for example, the New South Wales Plant Protection Guides have got some plans already for blueberries, etc. And we've worked with the New South Wales Department to include some fact sheets on the high priority pests and also some other information on biosecurity planning and incorporate it into their documents. So there may well be other ways that we can work with your industry to incorporate the relevant material into a document that the industry uses. So jumping off that topic to PICs, property identification codes. The first slide summarises essentially what we advised members at the November Plant Health Australia meetings, that we held a workshop on the 3rd of November. You may recall I presented to you all at the November meeting where we got to, with that workshop, and the meeting agreed that PHA should progress with this initiative, and Greg took it to NBC at their meeting in February, which is this slide, and NBC agreed, as you can see there, with the overarching principles consistent with the discussions from the PHA member meetings, and they also have tasked Animal Health Committee and Plant Health Committee to develop more complex and comprehensive business rules. And so Plant Health Committee held a teleconference yesterday, which was one of their routine teleconferences. And at that teleconference, Satendra Kumar, who's the chair of Plant Health Committee, made reference to the fact that NBC had tasked PHC and AHC with this task, and that the meeting in July, they will be looking further about how to progress this. So from the PHA perspective, you'll see the last sort of dot point on the slide. PHA will continue to work with PHC to develop the business rules, and we'll also work with Animal Health Committee and our Animal Health Australia as well. We will be going back to our working group that was agreed to at the November meeting, and the PHA will provide an update to you all about where this is at in the May and November meetings. And that's it. Thank you.
We do have a couple of questions. I might just add too that if for whatever reason you can't get your questions or you think of something later, please don't hesitate to email them into Angela, and we'll try and get a response back to you as quickly as possible.
So the first question is from Kevin Clayton Green, and has asked, can I tell you more about the Biosecurity Implementation Group? So the Biosecurity Implementation Group is the group that's formed after the Biosecurity Plan has been completed, and it meets once a year to look at the implementation table that's developed as part of the biosecurity planning process these days. So the Biosecurity Implementation Table is a document that sort of spans the 5 years of the review, and it also outlines all of the key tasks that should be undertaken to implement the biosecurity plan. So some simple examples, it might be develop fact sheets for all the high priority pests. It might be that the board of the relevant big industry body undertakes deed training, or it could be diagnostic protocols for each of the high priority pests are investigated to make sure that they're in place. So the Biosecurity Implementation Group then sits down and says, we've got this list of 40 or 50 tasks that would be ideal to do to fully implement a biosecurity plan. Which ones are relevant to do in year one, and which ones do we defer to future years? And then it also looks at which ones, who should be responsible for each. So if it's developing fact sheets, for example, it might be we submit an application to the relevant RDC to get funding support for a nominated person, whoever that person is, to write some fact sheets. If there's work to be done on emergency chemicals, you look at what's the best resource to do that and who's the best person to do that. If it's training of the board, the big industry body would take that responsibility on to ensure that their board was appropriately trained. So at the end of the first year, we have a second Biosecurity Implementation Group meeting, and we look at what's been achieved in year one, look at what we should do in year two, and have a look at the priorities and the issues that we identified for the life of the project shifted, and do we need to rejiggle them. But what it does is, when I mentioned it right at the start, it does open up that conversation between government and industry about how to implement biosecurity plans and how they should be prepared going forward. It's been a very positive set of discussions. The second question is from Trevor Weatherhead. He said, thought honeybees had a biosecurity manual, which we distributed to the industry. That's correct. And there's also now Be Aware, where it's about all of the information for honeybees is going, and all the additional information we can collect on honeybees goes into the Be Aware website, so it maintains its currency. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rod.